Um, let's start. Where's Bardo? Not here yet. Oh well. Will we do any practice in class? I think concepts without practice are ineffective. So it's certainly true that you have to practice what you learn, otherwise you can't really understand what you learned. And that's why Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad has this statement. Actually, this particular section is really good, and if I do that storytelling channel, I might tell this as a story first. It's really powerful. But the little quote from the end of this important section is Atmava Ari Drashtavya Shrutavya Mantavya Nili Dhyasitavya Maitreyi. My beloved wife, Maitreyi, to experience that Atma, learn about it, think about it, and make it a part of your life. So this is on the question of, are we going to do any practices? Like, don't you need practices for yoga? Or are we just going to talk about it? So of course you have to practice it. You have to practice what you learn. If you don't know a subject, then the first thing you have to do is shrota. You have to hear about it or learn about it, acquire information about it. And then you can't, that's not done. You're not done when you acquire the information. You have to think about, figure out what you heard. That's called mantavya. One second. Here's Bardo. So after you have thought about what you hear, then you do this thing called nidhi dhyasitavya, which means you make it a deep part of yourself. You make it a part of your life. You have to practice it. So it's undeniably true that if you don't practice what you learn, then you don't learn it. But the thing about practice is you do it, not me. I mean, I do it for myself, but you do it for yourself. A teacher can't hear for you, nor can a teacher think for you, nor can a teacher practice for you. So those are your responsibility. That's your homework. So that's why I don't particularly do practices in class. You can do like guided practice as a teacher, but really you're still not doing the practice. The student is doing the practice and you're teaching while they're trying to apply it. But since we have like a every 2 weeks schedule, I think to use that time effectively, you practice in between the classes. But never fear, because yoga itself is very practical, and the Yoga-Sutra is very practical. So there's going to be a lot of texts that talk about practices and very practical things. So the information itself will become very practical. And I just want to close this subject by sharing my personal experience, is that the hard part of practice isn't the practice. The hard part of practice is, first of all, knowing what to practice. And secondly, knowing how to practice it. And how to practice it when it includes things that are more than just physical, like, practicing the drums is simple. But when it includes something like, I don't know, improving your character or developing spiritual awareness or something, you have to, part of knowing how to practice it is to know why to practice it. And that's the hard part. Really understanding why to practice, really understanding how, and really understanding what. Once that is understood, the more clearly that's understood, the simpler and more natural the practices become. Practices are super natural and super easy, but it's the ignorance in the mind, in the student's head, that gets in the way of doing the practice effectively. So practicing without the theory is like frustrating. So never fear. The information itself includes the practice. Now, the next question. What's the best way to translate vritti? So vritti means that the way something moves. So that implies the way something operates, the way something works. So the word is used to describe how something functions. That's why I translate it as function. That's it. Simple answer. And then the corresponding question is, what's the best way to translate chitta vritti? So chitta, if vritti means function, then chitta vritti means the way the mind functions. So I translate it as mental function. Now, Patanjali uses the word chitta in a way that we may not be used to. So Sankhya, when it's fully elaborated on, it differentiates 3 subcomponents inside chitta, which you're familiar with. It differentiates ahamkar, buddhi, and manas as 3 separate little organs or functions of chitta. But the way Patanjali uses the word chitta includes all of those things. So in other words, it includes memory, it includes identity, it includes intellect, and it includes the reflexive, responsive feelings of manas. So, but however, when you talk about translations and when you have the English word mind, it's already a very ambiguous word. So already that English word mind sort of signifies all 4 of those components together. So I think the translation mental function is just fine. So chitta vritti is mental function. Now, questions move on to nirod. What's nirod? Actually, not just what's nirod. Actually, there was no question about how to translate nirod, but about how to achieve it. The first question is about how to achieve it. And Ari came up with a cool metaphor for this. She said, the mind seems like it's water. So if nirod means destroy, chitta vritti nirodha, the goal of yoga is destruction of the mental functions. So how can we destroy them? If the mind is watery, she said, maybe you could use fire or earth, because fire evaporates water and earth stops it, holds it, keeps it from flowing, right? And she even said fire is something like tapasya, tapas. So maybe fire is like practice and discipline, and earth could be something like asana, stillness and steadiness. So I think that is a really good analogy. In the section that we will do today, the new section, Patanjali is going to address that exact subject of how do you achieve nirod. And he's going to really actually say use fire and earth. Not literally, but it fits Ari's model perfectly. So what he says is he's used practice and dispassion to achieve nirodha. So you might notice there's one of the elements missing. It's air, right? Water is the mind itself. Fire and earth will like destroy water, sort of destroy it, right? Air, however, makes water wavy, creates waves in water. So to use this elemental paradigm to understand the situation, think of the air as the vritti itself, the functions of the mind. The vrittis of the mind cause waves and disturbances in the water of the mind. And think of the fire and the earth as actually attacking the air, not the water. Because the goal of yoga isn't to destroy the mind, but to destroy the functions of the mind. So actually the fire and the earth act upon the air. So fire consumes air, and earth stops it from, you can't get past the big mountain if wind stops. So when you get a stillness of air, then the water loses its waves. It becomes clean. You can see through it. So in the same way, when you use practice and detachment on the vrittis, then the mind becomes waveless or undisturbed. And when it's undisturbed, then you can see through it perfectly. Okay? So how do you achieve Nirodha? By practice and detachment, but that's what we'll talk about in the new section today. Good stuff? All right. And then another question about what's the most prominent of the 5 vrittis. The 5 vrittis, we normally focus most on experiencing. That's most of the time what we do is we experience. And that's called praman. That's the first vritti, praman, which means getting information or experience. The reason why this is definitely the most prominent vritti is because the other 4 vrittis are variations on it. So this is really the main thing that the mind does, even if you don't spend the most amount of time doing it. Even when you're doing some other vritti, it's some variation on pramana or information, experience. There's 3 ways to experience. The one we normally use the most is perception, which is pratyaksha. The other 2 ways of experiencing are variations of pratyaksha, just like the other 4 vrittis are variations of pramana or information. The other 2 ways of getting information are variations on perception. So one variation is called anuman, which is to think about your perceptions. To conjecture, I call it conjecture, to conjecture about your perceptions. And then the third thing Patanjali calls anuman, sometimes it's called shabda. I mean, he calls it agama, sometimes it's called shabda. That is to perceive and think about other people's perceptions. In other words, to get education or information or conversation. So since the primary vritti is experience, and since the primary way of experiencing is perception, most of the human mental energy, in fact, most of every life form's mental energy is devoted to perception. But the real question comes up when somebody says, that doesn't sound like me. I don't spend all my time in perception. My mind spends most of its time thinking about the past, present, and future, not really in perception. So that's okay. Not everybody has to be typical. Different kinds of people focus more on different kinds of things. Maybe you're spending most of your time in conjecture. It's not a different vritti, it's a different aspect of this one vritti of pramana. If you're thinking, then you're doing anuman most of the time. Or maybe you're doing a different vritti, imagination. Those are the 3 that human beings really like. Maybe, yeah, the top 4 in order for human beings in terms of popularity is perception. Imagine close runners up between conjecture, and then second and third is conjecture and imagination, and fourth is education. So that's okay. Just because the normal thing is experience doesn't mean an individual can't be more focused on something else. What's the difference? A new question. What's the difference between conjecture and imagination? So the first vritti is pramana, and the second type of pramana is anuman. That's called conjecture. When you get information by thinking about what you experienced, what you perceived. So what's the difference between thinking about something and imagining something? That's considered a whole different vritti. It's called vikalpa. So here's the difference. Conjecture, or anuman, uses experience of real things to infer the existence of other real things. So when you see something real and you think about it and get information about something else that's real, that's called anuman or conjecture. For example, you see a house with smoke coming out of the chimney and you say their fireplace is burning. You don't have to see the fire in the fireplace, but by seeing the smoke in the chimney, by conjecture, you gain information that there's a fire in the fireplace of this house. That's conjecture. It's not imagination. It's not imagination because you're coming to a conclusion about something which is real, a fire in this person's fireplace. Imagination, on the other hand, also uses real experiences, but it doesn't use the real experience to get information about another real thing. It uses real experiences to get information about something unreal or hypothetical, a theoretical thing. So, for example, if I say there's a flying elephant, Dumbo, the flying elephant, this concept of flying elephant is an imagination. Right? We used real things, real concepts, elephants and flying things, to come up with something that's not real, a flying elephant. All right, so the line or the demarcation of the border between conjecture and imagination is a little bit blurry because it relies upon the difference between a real thing and an unreal thing. And the difference between a real thing and an unreal thing is somewhat blurry. So not everything is equal, not every unreal thing is equally unreal. So let's talk about 3 different kinds of unrealness. One way of something being unreal is just if it's not here. If something is absent, then it's above. It's not here. In that sense, it's unreal. Or to talk about it as if having some relevance to here is a theoretical thing, because it's not here. So that's one type of unreality, is just being absent. Another type of unreality is it's not just absent, it doesn't exist anywhere. And a third type of unreality is not just that it doesn't exist anywhere, but it cannot ever exist anywhere. That's the most unreal thing. So I'll give you some examples. If I say I have no money, which one of the 3 unrealities is that? The concept of no money is an unreality, but we don't usually call it an unreality. We usually call it a hypothetical or a theoretical entity. The number 0 deals with hypotheticals and theoreticals. So if I say I have 0 money, I have no money, then I'm using the concept of no money is an imagination. It's not a real thing. It's an absence of money. So money exists, but it's not here. So therefore, what do I have? If I say I have no money, what do I have? I have something called no money, which is not a thing actually, but it's an imagination or a hypothesis. So that's vikalpa. That's one way that vikalpa works that's very close to conjecture. It's because no money is very close to a real thing. Then for the second type of thing, something that just doesn't exist. For example, if I say flying elephant or floating mountain. Floating mountains, they don't exist. Mountains exist, floating things exist. That's why the imagination can come up with this concept. The concept is real, but the entity isn't real. And come up with a concept of a flying mountain. But it's different than no money. Money exists. Negation of it doesn't exist. I mean, negation of it exists, but the object of no money isn't an object. This is different than a flying mountain. It doesn't exist anywhere, ever. Not ever, but it doesn't exist anywhere. The third thing is it doesn't exist anywhere, can't exist anywhere. There are very few examples of this, but one of them is non-existence. Non-existence cannot exist. So non-existence is more unreal or imaginary than flying elephant or flying mountain. Because something like a floating mountain might exist. It's not impossible for it to exist, especially if you maybe use allegory to change the context of the words. So for example, instead of floating relative to the surface of the earth. Maybe it can float relative to the sun. Then a floating mountain, all of a sudden, there's a lot of them. The earth itself is a floating mountain. So this is a kind of an unreal thing that exists in a metaphoric sense or in a different context. It's more real than something like non-existence, which just cannot exist by its definition. But even though this thing, non-existence, cannot exist, the mind still has a capacity to bring it into existence as a concept. That's why it's called Shabda Jnana in the Yoga-Sutra. It has the ability to be brought into existence as a concept that you can think about and compare with other things. And the reason why you can do that is because existence is real. It's combining two real things, existence and the ability to negate something. Okay, so that's the difference between imagination and conjecture. And there's different grades of imagination depending upon how unreal the thing is. So in summary, conjecture lets us infer real things from other real things. Well, imagination allows us to cognize hypothetical things. Okay? Okay. Now, how about thinking of the future? Like I spend most of my time thinking of the past, present, future, not perceiving. So what is thinking of the future? Is that imagination or is it conjecture? So to decide whether thinking of the future is an imagination or a conjecture, you first have to decide whether the future is real or hypothetical. So if you go about it my way, which I think is the Vedic way, then the future will exist. Actually, the future does exist because the foundation of it is right now. Right? The future is not an unreal entity. It actually exists in the present. The roots of the future are existing now in the present. So we shouldn't think of it as an imaginary or unreal thing. So therefore, envisioning the future is probably a conjecture, not an imagination. But it doesn't guarantee that what you or I are doing when we're thinking about the future is conjecture, not imagination. It really depends on how you're thinking about the future. But all I've just proved by showing that the relationship of the present to the future is that it doesn't have to be an imagination. It can be conjecture. So let's evaluate some examples. Let's say I'm going to be hungry in a few hours. I'm thinking about the future, right? What is that? Is that an imagination or a conjecture? It's a conjecture. I'm using my experience in the past of how long it took since after I ate a certain thing until I became hungry again. And I'm comparing it to the last time I ate now, and I know that in the future is X hours away, I'll be hungry again. So it's going to be a real state in the future, my hunger, based on real states in the past, my hunger. So it's conjecture. I'll be hungry in a while. It's not imagination. What if instead I'm thinking about the future and I imagine what it would be like to be a dog or a werewolf or something, a wolf in the future? That I would say, if I'm making a prediction, right, I will turn into a dog tomorrow. That's not an imagination anymore. That's not even an imagination. That's viparya, the second vritti. A mistake in the anuman. So viparya, the second vritti, is mistakes in the first vritti. The first vritti is to gain information. The second vritti is to gain it but with mistakes. So you can have mistakes in the perception, in the conjecture, or in the education. Mistakes in the education, conjecture, or the perception generate mistakes as a vritti. So if I think, oh my God, I'm going to turn into a dog tomorrow, that's a mistake. It's a mistake in conjecture, but it's not really an imagination. Because a dog is a real thing. So I'm not thinking like I'm going to turn into a floating mountain. That would be an imagination. And then how about these three things? What if I think I'm going to have no money tomorrow or in a few weeks, or I'll become a vampire, right? Or I'll become a floating mountain, or I'll become non-existent tomorrow. Those are imaginations of increasingly imaginative gradation because they involve impossible theoretical entities or states, okay? Divya. Sorry to make Divya wait so long. Okay, good. There's more questions. I know you're dying to hear them. All right, are thoughts objects of perception? Yes. This is why we consider conjecture a variant on perception. Anuman is a type of praman. Praman is perception, Anuman is thinking. So when you, in Anuman, you're perceiving your thoughts about something. So any object can be directly perceived or perceived by conjecture or perceived by communication or education. For example, we can see a fire, or we can conjecture that it is at the base of a pillar of smoke, or we can be told by someone that it's burning somewhere. So you can get, these operations work on thoughts just as well as on physical objects. You can directly perceive an idea that's in your own head. You can work with the ideas in your head, that's Anuman, or you can get ideas from other people. That's Agama. And not just thoughts, but emotions. Emotions are also objects of perceptions, and you can also experience them directly, or you can conjecture about them, or you can communicate them, share them. Now, the next question from the first session is, what's the difference between sleep, nidra, and imagination, vikalpa? Because when we're asleep, don't we do a lot of imagination in our dreams? So Patanjali defines sleep a little bit differently than the way we usually talk about it. So for him, his use of the word nidra is not the same as just lying down and dozing off. He says sleep is the underlying perception without anything specific being perceived. Abhav pratya alambana vritti nidra vritti. It's the underlying perceptivity without any specific perceptivity. The only thing you're aware of is the absence. So since in sleep, there's nothing specific being perceived, he's not talking about dreaming or just napping or something. He's talking about being out, being in a coma, being out, deep sleep. It perceives what you perceive is the absence of real things. So that's how sleep differs from imagination. It's not perceiving or experience. It's not perceiving real things or mistake. It's not misperceiving anything. It's not perceiving anything except if you take away all the perceptions, you just become aware that there's a perceptiveness. Like when there's noisy around, then you're hearing all the different noises. But when it becomes incredibly silent, then all of a sudden you become aware of your ears. You become aware of the hearing facility itself. So in deep sleep, it's like that. When there's a lack of things to be aware of, then the awareness is just vaguely aware of its own awareness. Sleep and non-existence are also not the same. He's not saying that you become aware of non-existence. He's saying abhav pratya doesn't mean non-existence. Abhav means non-manifestation. So sleep involves a real thing. The absence of something is realer. It's not entirely imaginary. And actually, it's not really, sleep is not, so you might say, but what about no money? The absence of money. It's not, sleep is not really just aware of the absence of something, because then it would be like an imagination. But it's aware of the perceptivity or the alambana, the underlying perceptivity. And the reason why it's aware of the underlying perceptivity is because there's nothing particular to be aware of. So Patanjali's sleep doesn't include dreaming. When you're dreaming, you probably are doing imagination, but you could also be doing conjecture, the mind. And then also Patanjali's sleep is interesting because you can even do it while we do it all the time, even when we're awake, actually. So the sleep, it has this other, it's a vritti, right? It serves a function. So what's the function that it serves? Well, what happens is it becomes non-aware of things. Sleep, this function called sleep, it enables non-awareness of something. So that enables forgetfulness. We become able to forget things by not paying attention to them, not reminding ourselves of them. So that's the function of sleep, is it allows certain memories to fade. So even while we're fully awake, like we're unaware of certain things right now. Like actually, I wasn't thinking of my daughter for a couple of minutes there. So if that would go on long enough, the longer and longer that goes on, then the more and more the memory of my daughter would fade. And then eventually it fades below the ability of the conscious mind to recognize it and becomes forgotten. That's why when people die, you have, times when you go to the gravestone or something, you remember the person so you don't entirely forget them. So another interesting thing about minds and vritti in general is that really don't have the misunderstanding that the mind just does one vritti at a time. The mind performs all 5 vrittis all the time. So while it's focusing on one thing, it's ignoring something else. While it's deliberating on some real things, it's also performing imaginations and comparing them with the deliberations. And it may be making mistakes and accurate perceptions side by side as well. And it's remembering something and forgetting something else. So it's all 5 are going on at the same time, but we'll say one of them is dominant at a certain time. Similar to how you say this object has Rajaguna. Doesn't mean it doesn't have Sattva guna and Tamaguna. It means Rajaguna is the most prominent thing in it. Okie dokie. All right, now, if the mind is the tool of consciousness, then why should we destroy its functions? I don't want to break my tools. So yoga is supposed to be the destruction of the functions of the mind. Why? The mind is my tool. Why would I want to destroy it? You don't want to destroy it, but you want to destroy its functions. But still the question remains, why do I want to destroy its functions? My answer here is because it's malfunctioning. It's like when your computer malfunctions. If any of you guys are really hardcore nerds, you'll be aware of the phrase terminating a process. That's chitta vritti. That's computer vritti nirodha, when you terminate a process. And you'll be, if you're nerdy, you'll know that sometimes you cannot shut down your computer. You cannot reboot your computer because some process is running wild and it's preventing the execution of the shutdown orders. So that's what's happening in the mind, actually, is the vrittis are malfunctioning and they're running wild. Because this tool of the mind is running wild, those processes have to be terminated so that the mind can be shut and reboot. So this is an interesting thing. Let me just read what I had down here in my notes. Because it's malfunctioning, it needs to be shut down. Its functions need to be terminated so it can be rebooted without the malfunction. That's why he says in the second statement, third sutra, he says, the reason why we want to shut this down is so that the seer can see himself. So it's not that you want to eradicate vrittis or perceptions, but you want to perceive without the modification or the distortion of the malfunctioning vrittis. According to Patanjali, without terminating the functions, the malfunctions can't be eliminated or even identified. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about this question. With another question related to it is, Is the ultimate goal of yoga to perceive the true self? So that's that statement. Drashtu swarupa avastana, avastita. That's the goal of shutting off the mental processes, is so that the seer who uses the mind can actually see itself. So that is the goal of yoga. The malfunction in the mind is exactly that. That's identified in the fourth text. The malfunction is sarupya vritti. Vritti sarupya itaresha. The vritti is imposing identity into the mind by its malfunction. So the malfunction, it superimposes identity onto the self via the perceptions of the functions. If we terminate the functions, then the superimposition of identity dissolves. And then if the superimposition of identity dissolves, Patanjali says that the self has a swarup. It has an intrinsic identity, which will become evident if the imposed identities dissolve. Then that's the malfunction, is the inability to, the not knowing of the inherent identity. Once the inherent identity is seen, that bug is removed from the software. Then the mind can restart and perform its vrittis correctly. A related question is, so if yoga is, the goal of yoga is to perceive the self, does that include Paramatma or Bhagavan, the Supreme Self? Yes, we will actually come to a section probably in 2 or 3 sessions from now, very soon, where Patanjali is going to explicitly mention this, talk extensively actually. Another question is if yoga is one of the possible bhakti practices. Bhakti practices. Let me correctly pronounce. So Patanjali's yoga is adaptable to any and all schools of thought. It's like the template on which any system builds its specific practices. So remember that. Actually, that's the great thing about it. But it also is one of the drawbacks. I think I'll talk about that in a second. In the sections that we just mentioned about Paramatma, you're going to see that Patanjali's yoga is intrinsically theistic. And it's intrinsically bhakti oriented. He's going to just come out and say it in black and white. So the intrinsic orientation of Yoga-Sutra is towards bhakti yoga. But non-bhakti schools, and even non-spiritual schools like psychologists, can very easily adapt the Yoga Sutra to their own needs. And Patanjali wrote it with that in mind, that you should be able to do that. So he wrote it as like a template for yoga, not as a specific yoga. You notice there's all sorts of yogas: karma yoga, jnana yoga, bhakti yoga, dhyana yoga, whatever yoga, kriya yoga, asana yoga, hatha yoga. That's because that's the way Patanjali created yoga, so that it could take all of these modifications. So a follow-up question is, if it's a bhakti practice, if yoga is suited to bhakti, then how come Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu doesn't mention yoga? Well, my reply is that Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu did mention yoga. Maybe you didn't notice it, which would be natural if either you didn't know very well about what yoga is, or you didn't very well know what bhakti is, what was being recommended. You might miss the connection. In Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Sri Rupa defined sadhana bhakti. Remember how he defined sadhana bhakti? He referenced Narada's statement, Tasmat kenapi payena mana krishne niveshyat. Do whatever it takes, just fix your mind on Krishna. So doesn't that sound a lot like what Patanjali is saying? Whatever it takes, he hasn't talked about it yet. Stop that mind from doing what it's doing and hold it in something. He's going to show that. He's going to say that very soon. Hold it in one place. The difference with the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu is it's being more explicit. Put it on Krishna. Because it's taking that bit generic template and applying it to something very specific. All the 64 practices, therefore, are tools for that. Sri Rupa said so explicitly when he quoted Padma Purana's decree, Smartavya Satatam Vishnu Vismartavya Najatuchit Sarve Vidhi Nasheda Sur Etayorev Kinkara. Always remember Vishnu, never forget Vishnu. All the other injunctions or any other injunction or prohibition is just a servant of this rule. So any other practice is just a practice of keep your mind fixed on Vishnu. Don't let your mind not be fixed on Vishnu. That's exactly what Patanjali is saying. Don't let your mind go here and there. Keep your mind fixed. The only difference is the specificity of Vishnu. But pretty soon you're going to see it's not that much difference because Patanjali is going to specify Ishvara as the best object for the mind. Rupa starts the practices of bhakti with another similarity is that Rupa starts the practices of bhakti with injunctions and prohibitions. Remember the first 20? And that's exactly what Patanjali does in his Ashtanga. It begins with injunctions and prohibitions, yama niyama. And Patanjali's practice, the whole practice, it's basically summarized and often referred to as dhyana or dhyana yoga. So dhyana is the 46th of the 64 bhakti practices. So I think it does mention the Yoga Sutra, it does mention dhyana and all that stuff. But then you could say, how come Rupa didn't just say, hey, just go look at Yoga Sutra if you want to know how to practice bhakti? It's because Yoga Sutra is generic. Patanjali designed the sutra to be generic and adaptable to anybody's needs. Whereas a book like Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu is not generic. It's specifically for Vaishnava yoga, and not just that, but for Gaudiya Vaishnava yoga, which is extremely passionate and intimate. So it's going to be more specific than Yoga Sutra. Good? All right, we got a couple more, one or two more. Is Patanjali, oh wait, this is the last one. Is Patanjali's Yoga Sutra older than the Gita or the Bhagavatam? Modern scholars date, so Patanjali Yoga Sutra, it's dated by the modern techniques between minus 200 and plus 300. So like BCE 200 is the earliest, or AD 300 or CE whatever 300. It's like a 500-year guess. And then the same scholars and the same techniques, they date the Gita, shift that forward by 300 years. I mean, backwards in time, earlier, 300 years earlier. So they date it between minus 500 and 0. So Gita is a couple of centuries before Patanjali. So the similarities between Gita and Patanjali, therefore, are Patanjali drawing upon the Gita. This is well accepted as far as I know. Then as for Bhagavatam, you know, they're basically using a 500-year window for dating these things. So it's already not very exact, but just the chronological sequence is basically known. That kind of vagueness is even more exaggerated when they try to date the Bhagavatam. So there's an 800-year range, or in some cases, if you include some fringe theories, is even more than 800-year difference. I mean, yeah, just scholastic theories, it could be 800, maybe to 1,000-year window. They don't really know. So, and also their theories and their methods for dating it are pretty poor, in my opinion. But they say it's anywhere between 200 AD and 1000 AD. But whatever the specific thing is, whichever year it is, you can see it's definitely after the Gita and after the Yoga Sutra. So the sequence is Gita, Yoga Sutra, Bhagavatam. And that's what scholars say. What about the tradition itself? The tradition also follows that. Gives the same picture. Not with those dates, but with that sequence, with that order. And there's also an interesting thing that also corroborates this. and suggests that the earlier dates in the Bhagavatam are more likely. It's that when you study the Yoga Sutra, the first commentary on it, which is called the commentary, it's called the Bhashya, which just means the commentary, sometimes called Vyasbhasa. That commentary on the Yoga Sutra, the indispensable commentary that nobody deviates from, is by Vyas. And Vyas was the author of the Gita and the primary author, like the original author of the Bhagavatam. So that's an interesting little close, back in when we were doing punk rock, like one person was in like 6 different bands. So similarly, Vyas is like involved in everything that's going on. He's involved in the Gita, he's involved in the Yoga Sutra, and he's involved in Bhagavatam. Some scholars conjecture that maybe Patanjali is Vyas, and vice versa. So that's the end of the Q&A. I'll stop it there and then we'll continue, okay?